So we're now going to take the story through the 20th century. We're going to start in about the 1930s and we're going to carry on till the 1960s. This is a period obviously of great change in the world. There's the Second World War going on for the early part of that period, and there's nothing like a war for driving scientific innovation. So this is a period where we went from a situation where computers were tabulating machines for counting censuses or controlling looms, to the point where they were electronic devices that could be programmed to do a whole range of tasks, and that's obviously what a computer is these days. Let's, as usual, do it by looking at some of the people involved. Our first person is John von Neumann. Now, von Neumann was working in the 1930s, the 1940s, and he was active across an amazing range of fields in science and engineering. He contributed in physics, electrical engineering, but he's mostly relevant to us here for his work in computer science. In computing, he devised the architecture that almost all modern computers follow. It's called the von Neumann architecture. He was working for the United States in the 1940s on the Manhattan Project, which was the project that produced the first atom bomb. Again, he contributed in that project across a wide number of areas. Some optics and things like that were down to him. But he also wrote computer simulations to simulate, presumably, how the bomb was going to do and what it was going to do. His architecture looks like this. We'll, in the next topic, look at exactly what all this means. But for the moment, let's just notice that that's the architecture that every modern computer uses, and in fact, it's the architecture that Babbage's difference engine used. So even though Babbage, all those years previously, was building a purely mechanical device, and now we've got much smaller electrical devices, the architecture is the same. That's the von Neumann architecture, which is still used today. The trick, of course, was going to be to produce a system, a computer, using this architecture that was truly general purpose and which could be used in real life for real applications. The first people who achieved this are these two gents, J. Presper Eckert and John Mauchly, who were employed by the US government to produce a general purpose electronic computer. By general purpose we mean a computer that you can program to do different things. Remember that Babbage's devices would only actually have done one thing, and Jacquard's loom was obviously only a loom, and the census counting device only counted census returns. So these people set out to produce a general purpose computer you could use for many different tasks. Of course, the US government had a particular task in mind, and that task was calculating artillery firing tables, making sure that the guns went in the right direction and the shells coming out of the guns went the right sort of distance. The finance for their project started in the Second World War but didn't actually finish till afterwards, so what they did was never actually used in a military setting. This is what their machine looked like. A fairly typical view of a late 1940s, early 1950s computer. It's an enormous room full of wires and levers and impressive looking banks of equipment. The problem then we have is this worked. This computer worked. It used a phenomenal amount of electricity, but it did work. But it's not really practical. You're not going to carry this around to work on the train or something like that. And part of the problem is the physical size of the components. It was all using vacuum tubes, which are big things you might find in an old television. So how are we going to go about making this thing smaller? Before we look at that, it's worth just having a look on the other side of the pond and recording that there were some British people working on this as well. That's Maurice Wilks, obviously in later life, but again in the 1940s he was producing a computer at the University of Cambridge. It was called EDSAC, and there is a picture of it. And that's the first computer that was produced in the UK, and it was sponsored by, we weren't sponsored by bombs, we were sponsored by a tea shop. That was sponsored by Lyons Coffee Houses, so it used to be an enormous chain of corner cafes, restaurants, and they wanted a system that would do their office tasks, sort of payroll processing, accounting, that sort of thing. And so they sponsored Wilks and his team at Cambridge to produce a computer that would do that for them. Eventually it became something called Leo, or Lyons Electronic Office, and was one of the first computers used in a commercial data processing kind of environment. But let's nip back to the war. And of all the people in the story, possibly apart from Babbage, this chap here is the absolute most important. This is Alan Turing, who I think we can reasonably say without his contribution we wouldn't be here learning about computing, and there certainly wouldn't be a school of computing in this university. He's the real father of computer science. To the general public, he's best known for the work he did at Bletchley Park in the Second World War, cracking the German Enigma cipher machines. He worked on electronic devices, which he called bombs, which could crack these really incredibly complicated German code. And obviously he wasn't working on his own, he was working with a lot of other people, but the general view is the work they did shortened the Second World War by 2 years and obviously saved an awful lot of lives. He did lots of other stuff that's deeply fundamental to computer science, which you can look up if you want to, and really is the founding father of the discipline. So if you study biology, you've maybe got Darwin or something like that. Computer scientists have Alan Turing. Turing was gay. He was gay. We know he was gay because he was convicted of it at a time when it was a crime. And eventually he committed suicide by biting into a cyanide-laced apple. And if you happen to have an iPod near you, have a look at the Apple logo on it, and you'll see there's a bite taken out of it. And there is a theory that the logo on Apple machines is a little nod to Alan Turing for his fundamental contribution. There are also conspiracy theories that he didn't commit suicide. He was in fact murdered by the Secret Service or something, because obviously he knew an awful lot of secrets, and they didn't want gay people who potentially could be compromised or blackmailed. Again, remember, this is the 1950s, having secrets, and so maybe he was murdered by the security services. Again, no one really knows. So, back to making things small. This is William Shockley. The thing which you might be able to pick out he's holding in his hand there is a transistor. And this was the first major step towards making computers small. So you might get a computer that can fit on your desk rather than a computer that will occupy an entire room. He's actually the co-inventor of the transistor, but he's the most well known. He won a Nobel Prize for Physics in 1956 for this contribution, and his innovation and all the companies that grew up around him led to the establishment of Silicon Valley in California that you've probably heard of. And the story of computing for the next 20 or so years really is just simply a case of making these transistors smaller and smaller and smaller, until you can get more and more into a particular small space. And eventually you get something like a modern processor chip or a modern memory chip where there are thousands and thousands of millions of transistors on them. Let's finish just by seeing how that miniaturization really has carried on. This is Gordon Moore, who's one of the founders of Intel. You've probably heard of Intel Pentium processors and so on, or seen the adverts, or maybe your computer's even got a sticker on it. The reason we're going to mention Gordon Moore here is, well, he's fundamental in the development of computing as well, but he coined something called Moore's Law. This is a graph of Moore's Law, and what he stated was basically computing power doubles every 2 years. That's a summary of what he said. He actually said the number of transistors you could economically put in a certain area would double every 2 years, and he said that in the 1970s, and it's proved to be true ever since. You can even extrapolate it up to things like resolutions of digital cameras or capacities of iPods. They do tend to roughly double every 2 years. It also means, of course, your computer tends to be obsolete every 2 years. That's still holding. People are debating still whether it's going to hold or whether it's going to carry on holding, or for how long it will keep on holding. So we've now got to the stage where, the mid-70s, late 70s, where computers are getting reasonably small, and maybe people might be able to have a computer in their own home. And the next thing that happened was home micros appeared. People actually could get a microcomputer. They could build it themselves or put it in their home. They could play games. They could write programs. And that's what's in the next part of the story.